Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Doriane Coleman, who is a professor of law at Duke University and also the author of this recent book called On Sex and Gender, a common sense approach. Welcome, Doriane.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Now, you offer up a common sense approach, right, which I guess is opposed to a radical approach, which is becoming increasingly popular. I think it was at one point limited to certain circles in academia and I guess, liberal politics. But now it's sort of become much more widespread, hence the need for you to reassert a common sense approach. And this common sense approach is one that advocates not sex blindness, but sex smartness, I guess, is the term that you use. And in the book, you, of course, go through a lot of the history of how sex and gender have been treated in the law. And I think for most people, this is a time where everyone's aware of the term sex and gender. They're aware of the fact that these things have been used differently. But now it seems like instead of separating these two out, they're sort of converging, or the idea of gender is displacing that of sex. And it's, I guess, a form of what some of my biologist friends call, biophobia, right? It's sort of a discomfort and maybe even a hostility to what biology has to say about us as humans. So I guess maybe the place to start would be, how different is this radical approach to sex from the previous investigations of the relationship between sex and gender?
So fantastic question. Your lead-in had a lot of assumptions in it that I'd like to, as a threshold matter, address really quickly, so we're on the same page. So I do in the book advocate for a common sense approach to sex and gender, and I underline the "and" in there, but not only as against what I in the book called the radical left, or what you've just called radical, but also the far right and its approach, because the radical left is you use the term biophobic, right? So has become, we can say, has become a bit biophobic or entirely biophobic, whereas the right, at least in its political advocacy, is genderphobic. And so yeah. My project was to recognize those two societal and political phenomena, and to try to bring some common sense to the discussion that takes into account both in a way that I think would be healthier for society than either of the two more extreme viewpoints. And then in terms of sex and gender as terms, I still find lots of people who are who are sort of, from educated academics to professionals to sort of regular people on the street who aren't from the coastal elites and don't have graduate degrees, who are perplexed about the different usages of the two words, right? And because both are morphing as a result of all the political discourse and discord, people are not sure they know what the difference is. In the book, I use sex as biology, and I use gender as either identity, expression, or role. And so, just to make that distinction clear from the outset, I think it's always helpful in the conversation around this topic to be clear about the language, just so at least you're communicating with the audience and the people you're talking to. How different is our approach to biological sex, or the biology of sex today, than it was before? I think that there is a sense, for example, in the trans advocacy movement, that that either the best strategy to achieving trans rights is sex blindness, and that is like pretending it doesn't exist at all, and or that it's not even real, or that it's like actually a goal unto itself. The sex blindness in a sex blind society is separately from the acquisition or the achievement of trans rights. It would make for a better world. It would make for a better political approach for everyone, not just for trans people or for gender diverse people. And it is pretty radical in the sense that they're advocating for a change in the meaning of sex in law, to either be gender identity or to at least include it. And at the same time, if it's just to include it, or where it's just to include it, they redefine biological sex itself to be just a handful of bits and pieces of sex, as opposed to sex as the whole organism. And that's really a fundamental change.
Yeah, you mentioned that you had been asked to testify before Congress, and you found yourself with strange bedfellows, I guess.
Right.
But I guess it's difficult in today's political climate to find yourself in a room full of people who might have what you call a common sense approach. Both sides seem to have migrated to these two extremes, where one denies gender and one denies sex, right? I mean, why do you suppose that is? It seems strange that the dialogue would be dominated. Are people just uncomfortable stepping into this conversation, and so therefore sort of stepping back and allowing the people with more extreme views to dominate the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right about that. I don't think I should say, it's not an empirical question for me. It's more my experience, and then some empirics here and there, not of mine, but in general, I don't think most people are in either of those two extreme positions. I mean, if you just take the United States, for example, I don't think that most Americans, whether they consider themselves on the right or the left, actually believe that gender doesn't exist or that sex doesn't exist or that we should do away with them, right? I think that the people with cultural capital right now, I think people who have the sort of political megaphone are the ones who are advocating those positions, and they may or may not believe them themselves, but they're just advocating them. They might believe them. Some people do believe them. Others find it politically expedient to take that position, and they've acquired the power in the same ways that I think that's just part of the polarization of our politics in this period, that people talk about it a lot in terms of how the primaries are run, right? People who have sort of the base of each party, the more politically extreme people in each party, are the people who tend to be dominating in the political discourse, notwithstanding that probably their average voter is not with them to the extent, to quite the extent that they might otherwise be on a number of issues, especially the culture wars issues. And so yes, in addition, and maybe because of that, people are uncomfortable having the conversation, right? I wrote an op-ed. I drafted an op-ed that didn't get published, called "Can we at least talk about sex and gender?" And I wrote it because it's been my experience working on the issue, domestically since 2019. I've been working on it internationally in the sports space for a lot longer than that. But domestically since 2019, if you're, especially in certain circles, certainly in academia and in another sort of politically fraught context, if you are not, if you don't sort of perform allyship with one or the other side, you either don't have a voice, or you're not legitimate, or you're sort of not with us in a way that can be really uncomfortable. And so I think that as a threshold matter, just even having a conversation like you and I are having is perceived, or at least in the last few years has been perceived as to the point of being perhaps social suicide, but short of that, certainly. And that's too bad, because these are both really important topics sex and gender separately and together are really important issues for lots of people, not just trans people. Sex and gender are both super relevant to all of our lives in multiple ways. And the law that's being proposed and made, no matter who's proposing it, right? If it's in the red states to bar all kinds of things for trans people, or in the blue states, or in Congress and in the courts, to push the trans advocacy agenda, that has implications for all of us. It's not just sort of this narrow legislative or judicial agenda for just a few people. So if you redefine sex, you're redefining for everybody, it's not just for trans people.
Well, let's talk about the role of sex in the law. I mean, law is about governing social relations, and of course, sex has played a huge role. I mean, a huge part. I mean, since the beginning of human history. I mean, but it's never really been a question of definition, right? It's only recently that we've had to really think in the law about how to define, right, sex or gender.
So I'm not sure I agree with you completely. I mean, so on one hand, yes. On one hand, absolutely. For example, all of early sex discrimination law, the sex discrimination cases, the civil rights statutes, when they used the word sex, they didn't bother to define it, because everybody understood that it meant male or female, and it meant the whole organism. And we might have a conversation about how that organism is develops, right, from the beginning in utero and throughout the life course. But we understood that we meant a male person or a female person biologically. I say I'm not 100% on board, and that's because sort of for centuries we've wondered about the description, and whether the description was actually biology or social construction, not the body itself, but just what was it about what we were calling sex was actually biology versus social norms or social expectations and things like that. So I think we have to distinguish, and that's why there is this distinction between sex and gender to start with. It's because a lot of what we thought of as sex over the centuries actually was gender, was actually expectations about people because of their sex, or roles we attach to people because of their sex, even as at the time, in those moments, people assumed that it was all part of the biology.
I mean, most of us think about the constitutional law or public law when we think about progress that has been made with respect to equal treatment of men and women under the law. But you point out that there also were these trends in private law, or in things like family law, where the disparate treatment of men and women began to kind of soften, even before 14th Amendment equal protection began to have some bite, right?
Right. So before equality law becomes the paradigm through which we think about how we treat men and women the same or differently, or we distinguish among them in law and politics and law and social policy, there were lots of people working on resolving issues that, for example, women had just dealing with society, right? And so making contracts, owning their own property, things like that. Today, we tend to see all of that history and that progress as equality, right? As being driven by equality norms, or as being driven by equal protection analysis and sex discrimination law and all of that. And really, at the time, it was just like, I need to do this business deal. I need to buy a piece of property. And it wasn't thought of as men and women are the same, and so we should treat them the same. It was really practical, really pragmatic, and the idea that it was we weren't conceiving of the problem as an equality problem. So a lot of the developments that we would normally think of, or today that we would imagine, arose out of equality law, or out of at least an equality paradigm, an anti-discrimination paradigm, actually arose out of contract law, out of property law, out of just sort of practical necessity. Women needed to contract, women needed to be able to buy and sell property, and do various things in society, and they were not they were just practical reforms that are sort of dated in the United States, for example, in the mid to late 1800s, depending on the jurisdiction, and there wasn't a sense as they were being developed, or at least this wasn't the prevailing sense, that that these were equality measures because men and women were the same, or because they needed to be treated the same in the law. It's just we just needed to get stuff done, and so a lot of the developments that that get us to the place where we're talking about equal protection in the sort of mainly the mid 1900s to start, early to mid 1900s. You already have this foundation of rights that doesn't come out of the firmament of equality. It comes out of just again, practical necessity and property and contract law a lot of the time.
When we talk about the women's rights movement, I mean, there are these deep analogies with the civil rights movement, right? Both in terms of the strategies that were used and the arguments that were used. But it kind of took a little bit of time before the women's rights movement were able to leverage the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. I was wondering if you could kind of talk a bit about that, because you tell that story sort of culminating, I think, with VMI. I mean, VMI seems to be like Ginsburg's opinion seems to be, or Ginsburg's input there seems to be sort of what you see as the best articulation of how we ought to be thinking about sex in the law.
Right. So, you've got the Equal Protection Clause in the late after the Civil War in the late 1800s. It's one of the Reconstruction amendments, and it becomes real on the ground for Black people, for formerly enslaved people. Really only starting in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. I mean, there's a progression. Obviously, it's not just these drops in the bucket. There's development, but we see real significant lawmaking progress. 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, and then you get the civil rights statutes in 1964. So you got like 10 years between 54 and 64, and the focus and the development of equal protection is really for Black people in the United States, for African American people, and led by African American people. I talk about Polly Murray in my book, and of course Thurgood Marshall, but there were lots of others who were instrumental in that process. And along the way, we get women, including Black women like Polly Murray, who see the promise of the work that's being done and the method of analysis. Equal protection analysis is being developed in the race area as promising eventually to advance women's rights as well, right? And so you get Polly Murray in the 60s and through the 60s and early 70s. Ruth Bader Ginsburg kind of picks up the baton from Polly Murray and refines the approach, the analogy and the approach, and in the 70s litigates a series of cases that sort of are the foundation for sex discrimination law. And again, I'm spotting a couple of people, I'm highlighting a couple of people, but of course it's a movement, and there are tons of really important others who participated. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely like a relay, and then also, but an overlapping endeavor, right, between the two movements.
Right, but when the courts are required to use some kind of scrutiny, right, whether it's strict scrutiny or some intermediate scrutiny, what they're scrutinizing, I mean, they're scrutinizing a couple of things, right? They're scrutinizing the purpose of the law, but they're also scrutinizing any kind of factual claims about differences, right, between, say, men and women.
Right.
And so in a way, the courts become a place where science is on trial, right? And I think you pointed out how,
right.
We saw this rapid exclusion of what we might call junk science based on faulty stereotypes. And now we're seeing something that looks a little bit like the rise of a new type of junk science. So, I mean, shouldn't the scrutiny, the higher level of scrutiny that we apply to these laws related to gender, um, keep this junk science at bay? So, I mean, in other words,
So let me go back.
claims about gender difference,
Right.
do claims about sex differences or gender differences get more scrutiny than claims about the absence of those differences?
I think you're right. So the way equal protection analysis has evolved in the area of sex and gender is that the law assumes that there are no sex differences, or that um, any sex differences that exist are probably irrelevant, and it pushes. And this is the effect of the analysis. I'm not going to get technical about it, but that's the effect. And so it challenges the discriminator, the person who would discriminate on the basis of sex. And I use discriminate to include distinguish. It's not only bad discrimination; it's any kind of distinctions on the basis of sex. Right? It assumes that those distinctions are not warranted, and that they are bad. Right? That distinguishing or discriminating is bad, and it puts the onus or the burden on the person who's making the distinction, or the institution that would be making the distinction, to show A, that they're real, and B, that they matter, and C, that along the way you're not hurting anybody else too badly, right? So those are the kind of the three guideposts. And when people make, and this has been the case all along, at least it's been the case since intermediate level scrutiny was attached to sex in the toward the mid to late 1970s, 1977, 78. The idea is that we're going to assume that it's false stereotype, unless you have a ton of data to prove differently, or a ton of evidence, scientific evidence to prove differently. And so people would say things like, um, you know, females mature faster than males, or females are smaller and not as strong as males, and those claims were challenged as essentially being myth and stereotype, or false stereotypes, right? False stereotypes, myth and stereotype. And if the state, for example, that wanted to discriminate on those bases or on those grounds, distinguish among males and females on those grounds, couldn't come up with a bunch of scientific evidence to prove it, they couldn't, their measure didn't withstand scrutiny. And at the time, some of that stuff was false stereotype. A lot of it was right, but they didn't have the means, either scientifically, or they just didn't feel like doing all the work necessary to put on the scientific case. And as a result, you get a reinforcement over the course of the cases of this notion um, that all of this stuff is false stereotype. And so what you're seeing today, for example, and in the introduction to the book that you referred to in the beginning of our conversation, I get in 2019 at the Equality Act hearing, I get sort of challenged by somebody from the National Women's Law Center, who claims that sex differences in human performance and sports performance, for example, are myth and stereotype. And that comes out of that historical firmament, right? It comes out of that, like the legacy of those cases that says, prove it to me that it's true. And the fact is, and this is the point about being sex smart, right? We can be sex smart now. We don't have to just sort of throw out sort of intuitions, or what we think of as our shared common experience. We actually have an evidence base for so many things today that we didn't have before, in terms of real sex differences. So we can put on the case today and be smart about it, and distinguish false stereotypes from true sex differences in a way that we couldn't before. And yet, even though that's the case, equal protection analysis has become so narrow and stingy in a way, right? That even real sex differences are viewed not necessarily as myth and stereotype, but sort of as inconvenient or irrelevant in some political sense. And so it tends to disappear the relevance of real sex differences in a way that I think is not so helpful. What I don't, I'd like you to ask maybe a different way your question about the current claims about gender. And I think you suggested that they're a form also maybe of junk science, and I'm just wondering what you mean by
Yeah.
that.
So, in other words, the claim, let's say, that male and female differences in athletic performance is a stereotype, or that is a product of nurture rather than nature. I mean, look, it's difficult to prove anything with 100% certainty. And I think you're saying that as a society, it does make sense to have a very, very high burden of proof for any claim of differences. But that burden should not be impossible to meet.
Well, two things. I actually don't agree that the burden should be as high as it is. I think that we've made a mistake, and this may actually be my most provocative claim. I think we've made a mistake to put all of sex into equality as an idea, right? That be the prism through which we view sex. Period. Right. That anything you say about sex or do with sex, that automatically belongs in the equality bucket. We've automatically got to like push it through this increasingly. It's technically intermediate scrutiny, but it's increasingly perceived as strict because that presumes that sex differences are bad. That presumes that any distinctions we would make on the basis of sex are bad. And I think that's wrong. I don't think sex is all bad. I don't think we should presume that most of it is bad. I think a lot of it is great. And so I think that we've made a mistake to see all of sex and sex differences as an equality problem. And so I wouldn't put it all through super strict analysis. And then separately, we do have a ton of evidence. It's not true that we don't have evidence that real sex differences account for real physical sex differences don't account for sex differences in human performance. I mean, I think that case is super solid, and it's evidence based from almost every direction that you can imagine.
Look, you were an elite athlete at one point in your life. I mean, you probably still are a pretty elite athlete. But this experience seems to have shaped a lot of your interest in this topic. You came into college athletics right around the time when Title IX was really hitting its stride, right? And this enabled you to perform at a very high level. This enabled you and other women in college programs to win medals and win contests. And so this seems to be the hot button issue of today, right? And you mentioned some of the athletes like Carter Semenya and Mia Thomas who are competing in female sports. Why is this? Is this? I mean, there other domains, of course, right? You talk about shelters, we talk about restrooms, and so forth. But how extensive I mean, how many different areas are there? How broad is the need to think seriously about separate domains or separate treatment of males and females in the law?
I'm going to start where you started, which is my interest in sex discrimination law, the way it's treated in law and policy, comes out of my entire life experience. It doesn't only come out of my sports experience. I think what we all probably know intuitively, if not in a studied way, is that sex and gender, but we'll focus on sex because that was your question, is a pervasive experience, right? It's physically, physiologically pervasive, but it's also pervasive in terms of our social relationships, in terms of our life experience. And so my life experience from when I was a little girl all the way through till today has been affected by my sex and the way, the way I get to navigate the world. Given that I am of the female sex as opposed to of the male sex, the way people have related to me since I was a little girl. I mean, we all have a version of that experience, whether it's studied or just intuitive. And so, and a lot of that experience has been, and this has been studied. Like, people study this, and it is a pervasive experience. And so that's separate from like every cell has a sex. To our bodies are constituted this way in an integrated biological sense, but also then our relationships with the outside world from when we're born. And a lot of that experience, and I'm speaking for myself here, but I'm assuming we all can say something like this. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative, sometimes it's not neutral, right? There are lots of things about sex differences that are wonderful. There are lots of things that are bad in the sense of discriminatory. And then there are a lot of things that just are, like we just are sexed, and that affects things about how our lives go on that are neither good nor bad. And so I want to say that I think there's this instinct to do what you just did, the move that you just made, which is like how many buckets, right? Or how many issues does it really touch? I think it's wrong to think of it that way. And that's one of the reasons I don't love equal protection analysis as being like the only way the law and policy see sex, is because it really is this pervasive experience. So I did, of course, have the experience I had as an elite athlete. I was New York State champion twice. I was a collegiate national champion. I was Swiss national champion twice. I carry a Swiss passport, and I competed professionally for a few years. And if anything cements your sense that sex is a real thing, it is competitive sports, right? There are lots of things that can do that work, but competitive sports definitely does that. And it did it in a physical way, like our bodies are different, and so we perform differently as groups, right? The best men and the best females, the best males have completely different performance trajectories, but also in terms of how the access, as I was growing up, certainly the access that I had to competitive opportunities was different because I was female than if I had been male. And so I had sort of the physical experience as well as the political or social experience of difference in that respect. And so sports is, I think, to your final question, to your ultimate question, sport is a hot topic in this period. It's, at the center of the culture wars over sex and gender, along with gender affirming care. And I think that it is because it's really low hanging fruit. It's super low hanging fruit. If there is anything, as I just said, that sort of proves the point of real sex differences, it's sex differences in athletic performance. And so, and the fact that's driven by nature and a bit of nurture, but mostly by nature, as opposed to just nurture, or mostly nurture and a little bit of nature. And people in sport know that. People who are not in sport know that. They get it because their little girls are playing soccer on fields around the country, and they see the difference between the way the males perform and the way the females perform. And so when the trans advocacy groups say sex differences in performance are based, or sex differences are based in myth and stereotype, or are myth and stereotype, or when they say, the only reason that girls don't perform as well as boys is because they've bought into the patriarchal project or whatever. It gets everybody, except for a little group of people over here, right? And so for the GOP, right, I think it's candy. I think we're handing out, I think my side, I'm a Democrat, I'm a liberal Democrat. I think when we say things like that publicly, and we push them and say, like, there's really no difference between males and females, females and women with testes, or it's myth and stereotype that they're any different in terms of their ability to perform in the arena. It's just so obviously nonsense that for the GOP, it's kind of low hanging fruit. And so if they want to attack the left and its positions on sex and gender, on the Equality Act, which proposes to redefine sex to include or to be gender identity, it's just candy. There's just no other way to look at it. And it's also a real election advantage for them, or an election issue for them, because they don't only get their base with that, right? They get a lot of people who just love girls and women's sports and think that it's an institution that does a lot of good for certainly for girls and women, but maybe even for men and boys.
But I want to be clear on what the legal issue is, because if it were simply a discrimination case against men, in other words, if a man was complaining that he could not participate in female sports, that would be thrown out, right? Because there is no prohibition on keeping men out of women's sports. The issue is, what is the definition of a woman, right?
I think that that's been a norm. We have assumed that that we can discriminate on the basis of sex in sports. That was not challenged, and it's now being challenged,
But
right, for the
look, I
first
mean,
time.
for
But
Michael
you have the
Jordan, who were saying, "Hey, I want to be on the women's, I want to play in the WNBA." I mean, that would just get tossed out without anybody even supporting it, right?
and the ACLU says this, the organization or the institution can put male, female, man, woman on the door, but they can't choose which door you go into. It causes trouble and people don't like it. And so, as a normative matter, it's not done very much. Like, mostly boys don't ask. We just do it. We just do it. We just do
Okay,
it.
so it seems like there are two separate types of potential agendas here. One is to um, simply abolish the distinction in law and culture between men and women, and the other is to sort of play around with the boundary, maintain some kind of binary, but make the admission into one group or the other more flexible, or more a matter of choice, or maybe a more elastic type of boundary, one that is driven more by gender than by biology. I mean, are those separate, or are they both sort of part of the same movement that we see here, cultural movement?
I think they are part of the same movement. I think that there are some people or some advocates who want to retain the binary in separate sex spaces, for example, on opportunities. They want to retain the binary, but they want a door through which, for example, trans women can come through, or trans men can come through, or non-binary people can come through. And that, I think, was what you were getting at when you were suggesting that Michael Jordan might be different from Leah Thomas, right? Which is you've got a male identifying as a male who would want to compete with women versus a person who is natal male who identifies as female.
Yeah, and there
want to
might be
competing with the
different there
women.
might be different criteria. In other words, the price of admission
Right,
could be
right,
surgery. The price of
right,
admission
yeah,
could be,
right,
an explicit
right.
way of being and acting, or it could just
Sure,
simply
sure,
be
sure.
check the box, right?
Yeah, right. And so here's so the story is, like, we all, you know, sex is, I say, I think sex is our first biological taxonomy. I make the claim in the book that it's probably our first social taxonomy. We have, universally around the world and for centuries, assumed that we understood that taxonomy. We haven't ever thought until recently that it was necessary to define it, to circumscribe it, and all of that. We're in a period where that binary is being challenged, that taxonomy is being challenged. And so now we're, like, trying to figure it out, right? And some people, and this is to your last question, some people in advocacy in this space, whether it's trans advocates or women's rights advocates, take the position that we still find value in the binary, in all the different spheres it might be relevant in, right? We find value in the binary, but we also find value in being inclusive of transgender people or of gender diverse people. And so, don't let Michael Jordan in, but let Leah Thomas in, right? And I'm just using them as prototypes for, and that's the goal. Like, that's the end goal. Other people see a sex blind society, right? I said that in the beginning, a sex blind society as the ultimate goal, as that's their utopia. And the move to include a Leah Thomas in a woman's space, not a Michael Jordan, but a Leah Thomas, is an incremental step toward that last end, right? And so, and you've got a mix of people. You've got a mix of people who still believe, and this is, 1996, when you called it VMI, United States versus Virginia, was decided. Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote the iconic opinion in that case. There were people pushing in that case including the Clinton administration, pushing for a full move to strict scrutiny and sex blindness, like the other side was pushing for race blindness. And Ginsburg and the other justices in the majority didn't go that far. But those who were pushing for it back then weren't pushing for it for trans rights purposes. They were pushing it just because they thought that was the best, that would yield the best society, right, for everybody, including for women. And we're still in that position. We just have different people making the argument today. So you've got these two possibilities. You've got the possibility that we keep the binary and you're just making an accommodation for gender within the binary, right? Or you go all the way to taking the doors down. And taking the doors down, I mean, you can imagine it literally like all bathrooms become unisex bathrooms, all sports teams become unisex sport teams. It's just like one open competition. And anything else you could imagine a single sex space, that would be a sex blind end, right? But lots of people don't want that, including lots of trans advocates don't want that. I don't mean all trans advocates, because lots of trans advocates also want sex blindness, but some trans advocates want just the door open for trans people to come through. Those are two different, that there's, we see sex, we don't see sex. In between, we still see it, and there's that door for gender diverse people to walk through.
You talked about when you were providing this testimony, there was another person providing testimony who was making the case that a sex blind society would be good for women, and you highlight that that's not always true, right? There are these tensions between what appears to be a significant chunk of the trans rights movement and what might be best for women. There's also a bit of a schism between what a lot of people in the gay rights movement think versus what trans. Why is it that sort of people who aren't paying attention to these issues think that all of these movements are sort of on the same side?
So it's definitely it's like an internecine war, if you will, right? So there have always been, or in the last 50 years, there have been longer than 50 years, but around the last 50 years, especially, multiple feminisms, and this is just women, and then there are trans women, and so there are lots of different feminisms, right? And then there's also, but you can say, from the outside looking in, you might say, oh, those are all feminists, and we're not paying attention to what they're fighting about amongst themselves. And it could be the same thing with the LGBTQ plus, right? We were saying for a while the LGBTQ plus community, and now what's emerging as communities plural, so that to reflect the fact that they're also experiencing, and I think that's normal, right? I think any sort of large umbrella group, there are going to be different perspectives on the best way in civil rights movements, for example, to get rights. What do those rights look like? So from the outside, it might look like, oh, they're all just a bunch of feminists, or they're all, but of course we're disagreeing. And one of the major disagreements amongst feminists in this period is the conversation that we're having, right? Does it make sense to elide the differences between females and trans women? Does it make sense to politically, or in terms of rights or otherwise, make sense to characterize us all as being the same, even as quietly we might recognize differences that matter? There's a big push. Judith Butler's new book, Who's Afraid of Gender, makes the argument that the ticket to entry to feminism should be an acceptance of trans women as women, period, and that's the starting point for all of feminism going forward. And the problem with that starting point, of course, is it's the very battle we're having, right? But I'll leave it at that.
Well,
for now.
I mean, I think that it's conventional wisdom among certain sectors of the population, certainly the seas that you and I swim in, that sex is really not a binary, but is a spectrum, and people point to different types of intersex people and so forth. But as you point out, I mean, these are exceedingly small numbers, right? They're a very small number of people. Why is the sort of prominence of the issue of trans rights so big relative to the numbers?
So, on sex being binary or a spectrum, I think the folks who um, claim that it's a spectrum are definitely, as you said, using the fact that there are um, some individuals, very few, less than 1% of the population, is has some difference or disorder of sex development. There are a lot of people in that community that don't like the word intersex, and they have pleaded with me not to use it. And so I try not to use it, but they just have some difference of sex development during in utero, and but they're still male or female. And so one of the reasons they don't like the term intersex is because they don't think of themselves as in between sexes. They think of themselves as being male or female because they either are XX or XY, and they have ovaries or testes that are aligned with their XX or XY. There's just some other phenomenon, might be an enzyme or something that's just different from typical. And so if you think about people who actually have gonadal tissue that's both male and female, that's such a rare condition. It's described in numbers, not in percentages. It's so rare. The way you think of sex as being on a sex as opposed to gender being on a spectrum is by taking the incidence rate out. So you just thinking about, what are some examples of people and their traits, and you might see a spectrum if you do that. But if you put the incidence rate in, you definitely have a clear bimodal distribution of more than 99% of the human population. So I think it's a political move to say that sex is on a spectrum rather than binary. Why it's so prominent is one of the most fascinating questions. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And by the way, you've just elided the difference between DSD, differences of sex development, and transgender people, which of course is they have some things in common, but they're also very different. In both really wonderful ways.
Well, and I think you point that out in the
why
book is that the definitions matter, and that you can make this, you can make you can make these groups bigger or smaller depending on how you define categories.
how
Yeah.
you play. Yeah. So why it's so fascinating? I mean, I think part of it is, part of it is political, like the movement to the civil rights and human rights movement in support of both people with differences of sex development and transgender people is very effective, right? They have phenomenal advocates. They've got phenomenal lawyers who are super well, really committed and have gained extraordinary cultural capital in this period. And so we see them a lot. So that's one just sort of practical political reality. I think that my current working hypothesis is that we're just fascinated with sex and gender. I mean, I think it's almost inevitable for human beings for whom sex and gender are so important. Again, first natural taxonomy, probably first social taxonomy, and all of a sudden you've got a movement coming along and saying it shouldn't be. That's really fundamental. I mean, it's really deep, right? And it's intellectually fascinating. I mean, like, let's say we don't have any personal, like I have a personal deep connection to it, maybe from sports and from my work. Someone else might have a personal connection to it because they are trans, or they've got a trans kid, or they have a DSD, or they know somebody with a DSD. But removed from that, I think it's just a really provocative challenge to something so fundamental in about ourselves and our society. Like, if you grow up thinking, understanding how fundamental sex is to you or gender is to you, and then somebody says it shouldn't be, or we're going to throw it out, or we're going to change what it means, or you can't use that word for yourself anymore, which is all the stuff that's happening, right? People are saying that you've got to start calling yourself a cis woman, or you can't. I mean, lots of vocabulary policing, all that kind of stuff about things that are so fundamental. I think it's super provocative, and I think it's super interesting. It's intellectual. It's a phenomenal intellectual challenge. It's an extraordinary political challenge. So yeah, I think it's there's lots of reasons that might be. I don't have a final answer for you,
Well, I
there
think
you
my
go.
economist friends would say that it is acting as a signal, right? A signal of commitment to certain ethical, moral, and political values, and that it's not part of some, you know, wide-ranging agenda. It's really just a way for people to communicate that they are part of a movement or a group that supports marginalized people.
No, I think that's right too. Right. I think that I think that's different from why does it
Hmm.
fascinate
Yeah.
us, right? Which I think was your original question. Which I was trying that's what I was responding to. But also, yes, there are a list of things that if you check the right boxes, you're signaling your allyship with a movement, with a group. And on the left, it is with this, with a movement toward to supporting and elevating marginalized people. On the right, it's to a traditional way of life, or to whatever. They're multiple. I mean, we've got them in two buckets. I know there are more, but sure, yeah, that too, that
So
too.
the statistics seem to suggest that among young people, gender dysphoria or trans identification, there are more girls, biological girls, who are interested in identifying in this way. Does that say something about our discomfort with being a woman in today's society? Is there something about? I mean, one would think that this would be the time in our history where it would be most comfortable to be a woman, right? And
Yeah,
yet there seems to
yeah.
be a profound amount of discomfort about becoming a woman if you're a girl in today's society. Is there something to that? I mean, why would that be the case?
So it is true that the numbers of kids and adolescents who are um, identifying or describing themselves as gender questioning, transgender, non-binary, is in the United States at least disproportionately females than males. Um, I find your question really fascinating, much more generally than in the sort of the trans separately from the trans issue, and that is we're really in this incredibly complicated period where girls and women sort of have never had it better, and that is in terms of you know spaces are not nearly as discriminatory as they were in some contexts, like education. Women have the upper hand. Girls and women have the upper hand now. We need to be focused on boys because the script has flipped on who's benefited by, especially elementary school, junior high school, and high school educational structures. So and then separately, we're also in a period, and this is the good stuff, right? We're also in a period where you're seeing a lot of female leaders as role models where you weren't before, where some things that we couldn't take for granted before, we can take for granted now in terms of our access and our rights and our cultural capital. And then on the science side, since since 2012, 2014, we're finally starting to do scientific research on biomedical research on the female body. And so we're learning a ton more, where everything was on the male model before. So tremendous advantages in women's health as a result. So you'd think, right? You'd think we were in this period where it was great. But at the same time, you've got these cross currents, right? You've got social media, you've got a, as yet not well understood I can't, but backlash isn't the right word, but cultural shift away from being mothers, so that the body as the female body as a body that would carry a baby to term, that would breastfeed a baby, that, all those things. The combination is, that stuff is not either what we want anymore. We don't want to be defined that way anymore. Yeah. So we're in a real moment of collision between these two sort of trends, right? The trend that is positive, almost uniformly positive, and these different forces that are confusing it, I guess, in a way. And so I just saw today, actually, a report, and I'm not going to get all the details right, but a report that a large number of young women are getting breast reduction surgery. And surprisingly so, and this is not transgender, it's not transgender male or trans men, trans boys and trans men. It's just cisgender females are getting breast reduction surgery. And some of the quotes that that accompanied the news report of the study suggested that the women and girls sort of didn't want to be bothered with the biology of their bodies, right? And they don't see themselves as being governed in the way they're presenting themselves or the way they live their day-to-day lives, being dependent on a body that was built, for example, to breastfeed a child, right? And so they're like, there's tons of cross currents at play here that may have something to say. They may have some bearing on the trends that we're seeing.
Well, look, it's clear from the book that you are a strong supporter of equal rights for everyone, and you're also a strong supporter of particularly trans rights and the trans community. How can we create zones for women in sports and elsewhere, and simultaneously protect those rights and express empathy for those groups? It seems like the legislation, I mean, would we need legislation? And if so, we hear about legislation around bathrooms and so forth that seem to be motivated by a lack of empathy for trans people. Is there a way to combine an empathy and understanding for their life experiences while at the same time to create laws that recognize the uniqueness of women?
So I in this conversation, I'm going to distinguish between females and trans women, right? And so to the extent that you're the different people are going to use the words differently, but maybe, there are women and trans women, or females and trans women, or we're all women, but some of us are female. That's a personal choice at this point, what language you use. I think that, my bottom line is that trans people, including trans women, of course, have every right to the same dignity and respect as anyone else. And certainly equal protection should attach to everyone, including trans people. I don't think we can resolve the impasses without recognizing the difference between sex and gender. I think that we can have trans rights, but not by way of denying sex. In other words, the strategy that requires sex blindness in order to achieve rights for trans people is not going to work for a lot of females. And so leaving the political right aside that doesn't want to see any gender diversity, and working with people who want to be inclusive but also recognize that there are differences between females and trans women, I think is really it's going to require that trans advocates take a step back and accept that in some places we need to see sex, and we need to be smart about it. And that's my sex smart, my sex smart request essentially is, it needs to be, our distinctions on the basis of sex need to be evidence-based. They need to be used as a tool to promote the good, and to do the least amount of harm possible in the process. And that means, for example, in sports, just to use sports as my low-hanging fruit, right? That's why sports is so much fun for me, is because it's low-hanging fruit too. Is where sex is determinative, you wouldn't want to elide the differences between. You wouldn't want to ignore relevant differences, just as we don't ignore relevant differences between males and females in general. We wouldn't want to elide the difference between a female and a trans woman who, for example, had not undergone any hormone therapy. But there are lots of settings in which we would not need to make a distinction, right? And where that distinction isn't necessary, then we don't make it. I'm not somebody who. I mean, we make distinctions all the time for all kinds of reasons. Leave sex and gender aside, and a lot of times, I mean, most of the time when we do it, we're doing it for good reasons, right? We have law school admissions, we've got organ transplant lists, we've got all kinds of triage mechanisms for all kinds of things to achieve a goal that we think is valuable. If we think it's valuable to see females on the podium, then we're going to have to distinguish between people on the basis of their sex-linked biology. We can't ignore that. And so, I mean, if we don't want to see females on the podium, if we don't care about that, and that's a policy choice, right? Then we don't make the distinction. But being inclusive means taking into account relevant differences and ignoring differences that aren't relevant, and that's really important to do. And we shouldn't shy away from that. At the same time, demonizing people who are ultimately in the group is not a good idea, because there's no reason for it, and it's just mean, right?
Well, Doriane, thanks so much for joining me. The book is called On Sex and Gender, a Common Sense Approach. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate it. Have a great day.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.